What's up, Power Movers? I'm Anna. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to have a discussion with Blake Stanfill of Trepwise and Kwamena Aidoo of the Square Button. We're talking about what it means to file bankruptcy, when and how to file, and how to move on afterwards. It's a tool you can use to wind down your business or turn it around. And we're going to hear from the experts on how to best leverage that. Take it away, Blake.
Thank you, Anna. So as Anna mentioned, we are doing this as a part of PowerMoves.NOLA. And PowerMoves.NOLA is an initiative of the New Orleans Startup Fund and the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, in which we are providing technical assistance and business support services to Black and minority-owned enterprises all throughout the New Orleans and Southeast Louisiana region. And in these challenging economic times brought about by a global pandemic and recession and so on and so forth, we know that a number of our small business owners are faced with the dilemma of wondering when to know if it's a good time to actually shut the shop down, when and how one might go about doing this process. And is that the end of the world? What's next for entrepreneurs and for businesses coming out of or going into this scary and somewhat opaque environment of filing for bankruptcy? And so we thought it'd be good to set for business bankruptcy. So we thought it would be good to have a conversation with some experts, with folks who've worked in the business turnaround space, with someone who has even worked in operations for organizations that have purchased entities that were closing down, and really so that we can give some insight on when it's time to maybe shutter your business and iterate or spin out into something different. And so that's why we are excited to have Kwam Aidoo, a New Orleans native, on this call with us to walk through that work. And so I want to hand it off to Kwam to give a brief introduction. I mean, I can't do it justice given all the wonderful work this gentleman has done. So Kwam, introduce yourself to the people.
Blake, you're too kind, man. As Blake said, my name is Kwamena Aidoo, go by Kwam. Edna Carr graduate. So yes, from the West Bank, but I still claim New Orleans. I left here after graduating at Carr. I went up to Columbia University where I studied computer science, but very quickly found myself in the finance space. So my first 5 years after undergraduate, I was at a hedge fund doing operations and risk management. The hedge fund invested in stocks and other financial assets. I helped to make sure that during the first part of my career that our books were tight and clean. And during the second part of my career, I focused on risk. Upon leaving there, I went to Wharton for business school. I did my pre-MBA summer, my MBA summer, and 3 years after that at UBS Investment Bank, covering the power and utility sector. At UBS, I did a lot of work advising utilities such as the Southern Company, Southwest Gas, Procter & Gamble, Exelon, et cetera, on financing decisions, acquisition decisions, divestiture decisions, et cetera. I left banking. I made my transition to private equity. So my first 3 years after investment banking, I was at a publicly traded firm called American Capital, where I was on the operations team, right? So being on the operations team for a private equity firm, the simplified way I explain it is that most, if not all, private equity teams have a buyouts team, right? So that is a team that goes out and finds companies to invest in, determines whether they're investable, and then makes an investment, and then works with the leadership of that company, the CEO, the founder, the CFO, et cetera, to make sure that they're operating according to their investment thesis. When a company at American Capital would become challenged or distressed, they would send that company over to my team's portfolio. And my team was responsible for getting to know the business, getting to know the business owners, really immersing ourselves in that company, identifying where the problems might be or were, identifying if those problems were fixable or not. And if they were fixable, working with the management team to fix them. And if they were not fixable, working on the exit. So we had a good bit of success there that contributed overall to American Capital's success. American Capital is ultimately acquired by Ares. And in 2016, my team at American Capital spun out and founded a firm called Canon Capital. Well, we raised approximately nine figures or so of capital that we invested in about 5 or 6 companies, right? And there we all continued our kind of operational leaning. We were industry agnostic by nature. We're problem solvers. We continued that. But personally, I took on the role of the director of research, and my job as director of research was to drive our investment thesis development, because when we spun out and formed Canon Capital, we were no longer just fix-it guys, we were also investors, right? And over the span of the 6 years that I was at Canon Capital and American Capital, when I say immersed in corporations, I mean really immersed. I accumulated about 6 years or so of CFO and interim CFO experience at a variety of portfolio companies. So that was great and valuable because I was kind of in the trenches with the founders. I was learning how founders think. I was learning how CEOs that fix companies that founders have departed from think. Had a really strong team of experts that I learned a ton from. And before long was able to help a few companies on my own, right? 2018 or so, I got the opportunity to move back home. Thankfully, my wife got an opportunity down here, which opened some doors for me, and commuted back and forth to Boston for about 1.5 years. But in February of 2020 of this year, I joined a local founder, Alan Square, at a company called the Square Button. So at Square Button, I'm a CFO. I work very closely with Ann Holliday, our Director of Corporate Development, on their mergers and acquisition strategy. And for those that don't know, I find Square Button to be an inspirational story within the local New Orleans community. Native entrepreneur, has grown this business from nothing to pretty sizable, over 100 employees across 2 states. Square Button, if you don't know, it's a holding company that owns and operates businesses on 2 platforms, right? On one platform, we have a professional services platform, of which Square Button Consulting is one of our operating companies. And our construction services platform, we've got GH Mechanical and Services. It's an HVAC and plumbing focused mechanical construction company.
Perfect. So as you all can see, we are strongly representing in the Wharton community here. So Kwam and Alan are Wharton alums, as am I. And so yeah, it's really great to have Kwam and his expertise to lend to us in this exciting conversation. So thanks, Kwam, for your background, and I think we'll all benefit from your knowledge and wisdom today. So let me get us kicked off here, and I would love to maybe talk about the different types of shutting a business down or actually filing for bankruptcy. So there are a few different types. So can we maybe let's start off there and thinking through what are the types of bankruptcy and business bankruptcy and what that means for a business. So I'll start us off with the different types, and Kwam, I'll kick it to you afterwards, just for your I guess, some color on what this might look like in real life. So there's the Chapter 13 business bankruptcy, and that's really for sole proprietorships and individually owned businesses, which is really just an adjustment of debts of the individual. So that's like for solo shops, in which you want to just reorganize your debts and not necessarily getting rid of the business. And you kind of restructure and decide what to repay based on what you earn. There's Chapter 7, which is a liquidation. That's when a business really just doesn't have a future worth speaking towards, and that's when the assets of the business are or it's appropriate, I guess, when a business doesn't have like super substantial of assets. And so a trustee is appointed, and the bankruptcy court kind of takes possession of the assets and distributes them amongst the creditors. And then finally, there's a Chapter 11, which is a business reorganization. And so reorgs typically happen when businesses have a viable future, or they have a chance to kind of rewrite the ship. And so this is where you might create different enterprises or shut down certain loss leaders within the corporation or partnership. That happens in the Chapter 11. Now, we know a lot of our businesses in the New Orleans area probably fall more so in the Chapter 7, what will fall more in the smaller business and the solopreneurs, the solo proprietorships, and so on and so forth. And so I know that's probably the most germane examples, but Kwam, I wanted to ask you, just in your experience, as you look across these different types of tools, these different types of bankruptcy tools, I guess, how often do you see businesses turning to these tools, and talk to me about how often you see businesses turn to these tools and the different types of tools that exist.
Sure. And before I jump into that, I just want to add for clarity that I am not a registered financial advisor or lawyer. So when you want to get into the technicalities of each of these things, please speak to your experts. When you want to talk business considerations, Blake's your guy, I'm here, and I'll just talk from my personal experience, right? And a lot of the time has been a lot of my personal experience has come as either an investor or someone working with a business owner, if not a business owner. And so when it comes to bankruptcy, how often you see it, I think it happens more often than people think, is the first thing I'd say, right? Now, in the roles that I've been in, I would look at a few options, right? So one is, can I sell this business, right? And the sale might be, if we're talking about in a situation where bankruptcy is an option, you may not necessarily get top dollar for the sale, right? But you might be able to get enough to cover your liabilities and break even if you're lucky, right? Or break even on a negotiated set of liabilities without entering the courts and taking the credit hit, right? There is the just liquidation, shut it down without the courts, where you just sell off the assets you have and shut the shingles, make sure you pay the last payout, lay everybody off, et cetera, right? And then there's this bankruptcy, right, kind of situation, right? Interestingly enough, if you read closely some of the articles around bankruptcy, sometimes you hear bankruptcy termed as bankruptcy protection, right? It's not, again, it's not natural to think that way, right? The concerns about your credit risk are, there are credit impacts, like the Chapter 7 stays on your credit for 10 years, and Chapter 13 on your credit for 7. But there are situations where I've found that they have to be a realistic option, right? And if I haven't seen them personally, I've been on the other side of helping a company get out of it, right? Because it creates opportunities for acquisitions at lower prices. But Yeah, so one of the things I'm looking at, right, if I'm trying to assess whether or not bankruptcy should or shouldn't be an option, right, is so what's causing the financial burden or the pain, right? Is it macro related? Is it industry specific, or is it company specific, right? Is it something that is fixable, right? Because the level of fixability or not fixability, right, informs whether it's worth, it's one of the first steps informing whether or not the business is worth saving, right? And as Blake, as you just highlighted, right, there's a bankruptcy path for saving a business and there's a bankruptcy path for shutting one down. So even if you're down to bankruptcy as my like last resort, last option, you need to figure out whether the liquidation is best for you, or whether there's an actual, like, if you reorganize this business and you're able to kind of achieve this reorganization plan, if you will you come out on the other end whole, for lack of better words, right? You don't want to go into Chapter 11, reorg, settle all this debt, and then within 6 months be back in a position where you are financially distressed again.
Right.
But sometimes we run into small hiccups, right? Sometimes we run into COVIDs, right? And it's like, okay, well, my cost structure was built for this type of business. I'm going to be operating at 50% of that level for the next couple of months, maybe to a year or so. But I borrowed all this money, I took on all this debt for the larger business, right? I need help restructuring that, right? That's where your Chapter 11 can be potentially helpful, right? And what happens there is that you set your business plan, right? A judge, a bankruptcy court has to approve that business plan. And in resetting your business plan, you identify what you can or cannot play during that period, right? And so the judge will determine whether or not the plan makes sense, whether or not your repayment plan makes sense. Sometimes you'll get to write off some of that debt. Sometimes you won't. It all depends on the judge. But the idea is that this is a workable solution and you're going to come out on the other end of it stronger, right? So that's a real option. Now, I was looking around, like, I'm sure there are companies that you guys didn't think about that filed for bankruptcy. So J. Crew filed for bankruptcy recently. Who else was out there? Neiman Marcus. It's another one that filed for bankruptcy recently. I think everybody knows how often JCPenney files for bankruptcy, but all three of these companies actually just emerged from bankruptcy since like September, right? September, October, November, right? And a few of them, I can't remember which one. One actually entered bankruptcy in May because of COVID, right? So worked their reorg. Go ahead.
No, I'm just going to say, so what I'm hearing there is that in many cases, bankruptcy isn't the end of the world. Business bankruptcy isn't.
It doesn't have to be.
Right. There's an Elizabeth Warren quote that I'm reminded of, in which she said, I think she was like, bankruptcy is about financial death and financial rebirth, right? And so it is certainly can be something that can be leveraged and used in different, really in different ways. And so let me ask you this. You know, we focus a lot on bankruptcy. Like what's, and I know that is one end of the road option, bankruptcy is. When you're assessing a business, if you were advising a business that, you know, has gone through a difficult economic time over the last 9 or 10 months, and has had to lay off employees, who's exhausted the PPP funds, and is really, you know, thinking about, you know, worst case scenario, I suppose. What are those factors that you're considering, or like what are you thinking about when it comes time to saying, hey, we should probably look to shut this down? What's the litmus test, I guess, for that a business should be administering?
So, you know, the first thing I'm doing is sketching out what the next 12 to 18 months looks like, right? With that comes like some sort of set of financial projections, right? But like how is your cash flow going to look over the next 12 to 18 months? That helps me determine how much cash is needed for you to survive what could potentially have, additional impacts and keep your business oppressed for like extended period of time, right? Our economy was due for a recession at some point anyway. So prior to COVID, we were already talking about recession scenarios, right? Another thing that I do is I look at multiple scenarios. What happens if COVID ends in 6 months? What happens if it ends in 12? What happens if it ends in a recession? And what are the three? I'd like to pick 3 or 4 scenarios, right? And something I learned with my team up in American Capital, probability weight them, right? Just take an educated assessment of where I expect the world to be, right? But also stress test how much can I take before it's a no-go, right? So that I understand what my milestones are.
What would that look like in that stress test? Like, give us an example of a stress test that you might apply.
Yeah. So okay. So let's say I operate a business that is, since COVID started in March, operating at 50% of where they plan to be, budget, right?
In terms of revenue.
Revenue, exactly, right? Let's assume the gross profitability moves in line with revenue for simplistic purposes.
Yes.
So what I really need to figure out are my SG&A operating expenses, right? How much SG&A can I cover at this current business level, right? Is it realistic? Like, I can talk about cutting my operating expenses, but realistically, like, what would it take to cut, let's say, 500,000 off, right? Sometimes people are like, oh, I can just cut my operating expenses. They look at their operating expenses, like your salary is 50% of the cost, right? Or if your salary is 50% of the cost, it's not really as movable as it seems on paper, right? So you really have to understand what's going on in those operating expenses, and understand where you have flexibility to move or not move, right? There are certain cost cuts that you might make that could be damaging for the business. In certain industries, if you stretch your vendors out too far, you may or may not survive, but you definitely won't be able to count on them in the favorable pricing you had, right? If you put out poor quality, you might lose customers that you never get back, right? And so it's not just a financial exercise, it is a kind of wholesome business operating exercise. So how long can I really run at this level?
Gotcha. Right?
Is one scenario, right? And then you can ask scenarios about when you think the recovery will happen, right? But you'll start to get a number of how long you can run or how much you would need to get through an extended period of time, right? And ideally, you're doing this before you're at risk of defaulting on some debt.
Got it.
With a lender or something, right? Like, you want to get out ahead of defaulting on debt. There's a limit to which you can stretch your payables vendors. Every vendor is getting stretched right now and is creating trickle down pain down, for other businesses. But you want to try and get out ahead of that because once you default on your debt, you could lose your business without recourse to it, right? Just based on whatever your loan collateral package may be. So you want to get out ahead of that, and really figure out what the amount is that you need, and then kind of really understand all of your options, right? For me, it might be less painful. Let's say, okay, so we had a company, one company I worked with, they were a pre-revenue company that was creating some sort of semiconductor technology, right? My fund had invested a good bit of equity, right? In the tens of millions of equity into this technology. And we had gotten to the last iteration that we could possibly take, right? Like if this version didn't work, we were taking, let's say it was another year or two to getting to another prototype that might work.
Gotcha.
And could we fund another year or two? But yes, would it make sense to fund another year or two, right? Those are two different considerations, right? Like, how likely am I to be successful at the end of that next 2 years?
So that sounds like an important part of that stress test is not only could you, but almost should you.
Right. Is it worth it? right?
Yeah.
Given everything you've put in to date, right? What's your return, right? So yeah, understanding what your metric of success is critical in the first part, right? Like so that you understand whether or not it's worth it or not to continue fighting this fight.
Yeah.
We determined ultimately that it was not worth it to continue fighting the fight, but the technology still has some value.
Mm-hmm.
So we had to find somebody that valued whatever we had already, right? And it was an artistic dance selling something that did not exist, but ultimately we sold it, right? Now, we didn't make back our investment, but we didn't go through bankruptcy and have some random vendor, somebody like take over the technology because we waited to the last second to do it, right? Or just go through legal proceedings. And in doing it that way and selling it, we actually avoided some of the legal costs that come with bankruptcy, right? And so and to hit to our credit. Another thing I want to make sure people think about when they're thinking about bankruptcy is their entity formation structure, right? Certain structures like LLCs have different levels of protection for the individual business owner. And I think you mentioned that there are a lot of business owners that are S corps here, so that matters. That's significant, right? There are ways to set up entities such that any kind of legal issues or bankruptcy proceedings are confined to the business entity and not to you personally. It may or may not be too late to change that setup, that situation, but that's something again that you should speak to your counsel about. So at a fund, right? While we're very confident we're able to generate returns, we structure our business entities to limit our liabilities. Right?
Gotcha.
So it's something that I think people should just think about when they're thinking about how to form their business.
Gotcha. You just outlaid, and I think it's really important. I think that the framing of our conversation has been on bankruptcies. I think a broader way to think about this though is, what options do you have when you are realizing that your business is no longer viable, or your concept or your product or whatever the case may be. And
right.
It sounds like there are other options at your disposal in addition to the bankruptcy conversation, right? You found you identified someone in the space that would value the technology in an as is condition, and you're able to sell it, right, and recoup some of the monies, right? You also mentioned that you've worked in the mergers and acquisition space. Is that another viable space for folks to think about, for business owners to say, okay, well, this isn't going where I want it to be. Could I maybe, sell or collaborate with a competitor and, allow my business to be acquired in that way? What have been your experience, I guess, in that space?
Yeah, it's absolutely a path. I would say this is where the defining success early and staying on top of your options throughout the life cycle of your business, right, before you get to the distress point is valuable. Because if you go and try and sell and they know you are distressed, you will get the valuation that you would expect, right? It's a negotiation. But let's say, you're working in an industry where like, I think this business is going to be automated 2 to 3 years from now. So right now I'm not distressed, but I'm not growing anymore, right? While I'm still attractive, is there a buyer out there for this business? And so when we've sold companies, it wasn't always, like this isn't fixable, therefore sell it and get whatever you can. Sometimes it's like, yeah, we had a really good year this year, right? There's a potential for somebody to make more money doing this, but we might not be the best equipped person to make that money, right? Or we might not like what we see further down the horizon, right? So M&A is absolutely an option to get the best value for your M&A. You want to be forward looking as much as possible, or have somebody on your team, have somebody you can go to, your advisors, business counsel, et cetera, that can help you look out a bit. Because a lot of times when you're running a business, you're a sole proprietor, the CEO, of what you're in the weeds.
Yeah.
And that having that visibility, that foresight, that future planning, like it takes capacity and bandwidth that most kind of 100% owned founders don't have time for.
Right. Let me ask you this then. You know, one of the barriers that at least that I've experienced when talking to business owners about small business owners, particularly in a small city like New Orleans, is everyone knows everybody,
Yeah.
and like it or love it or loathe it, everyone is in everyone else's business, and I think there is a fear of of being a failure, of being viewed of as a failure, or as viewed of their business as being unsuccessful. How do you think organizations or business owners should approach communicating that decision to customers or to creditors or to the community? How could that gracefully be done? The idea of moving towards shutting a business down. Like, what is that? How have you seen that done, I guess, successfully or tastefully in the past?
Yeah. I think it takes a level of honesty about what your business is or what it isn't, right? It takes some studying the market and understanding what is attractive to potential buyers of your business before you step out there and put your business out there as for sale, right? Number one, it helps with that anxiety of wondering whether or not you're doing the right thing because you better understand the market, right? Like that company that I said is in fear of automation, right? There might be some aspects of that business that are very valuable. When you step out there and sell that business, you're focusing on the valuable aspects of that, right? But you can't highlight what's valuable to a buyer until you understand what buyers value. A lot of times as business owners, like this is our baby, we built this thing. We want people to see the value that we ascribe to the business. That might not always be what sells, right? So at the end of the day, you can worry about being seen a failure, or you can prove that you were a failure, or, right, you can take this assessment, okay, this is what this is what this isn't. If I need an outside perspective, bring in an outside perspective, like, how do I maximize my outcome based on all of these different options, right?
Right.
If you're at this point, it's already a painful conversation, but it's a necessary one because you can land this plane a lot of different ways, right? And while not all of them will be suboptimal, some will be far worse than others. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I'm reminded of the poet Sean Carter, also known as Jay-Z, who's like, a loss ain't a loss, it's a lesson, right? And there's a way in which you can make a loss though, and that is by being stubborn, and that is by trying to pretend something isn't what it is. And so I think that that's an important note for our listeners and for our thinking about end of the road for their businesses.
I wonder if Sean is missing Rockaware right now.
Really? Like
probably not.
Probably not. He's okay.
I think he's doing all right.
I think he's doing all right. So yeah, absolutely. There are times in which even the most esteemed amongst us have decided to let go of a brand or let go of a business or let go of something that they held near and dear. But it's the right thing to do. And they've been able to continue to produce and continue to be productive folks, business people in society, which I think is a great segue because I want to talk to you about like what happens next. So we know that, again, I think Kwam noted, neither he nor I should probably say this as well, are registered investment advisors. And so we know that in order to actually take the steps of shutting your business down, at least in a legal way, filing for bankruptcy, you should consult the advice of a lawyer, a registered financial advisor, and in those types of professionals to go through that process. That being said, I want to, that's technical, and that's all stuff that you can just like Google and kind of figure out. I'm more so wondering about like the what happens next. You know, if Elizabeth Warren says that it's a rebirth, could be a financial rebirth. You know, are all things shot? Like if you file for bankruptcy, or if you close a business down for that matter, is your reputation shot forever? Can you never get a business loan again? Like, can you talk to us about what that looks like in a post I shut my business down, or I had to sell, liquidate, or I had to you know, sell my business to someone else? What happens in a post closed shut business down world?
Yeah, you know, it depends on how you shut down, right? If you file 7, you know, you've got this bankruptcy on your credit report for 10 years. Well, depends on how you shut down, depends on what you need to start back up. Right? You got this credit bankruptcy on your credit for 10 years. This venture was your first venture and it failed. If you need to borrow capital from a financial institution, that could be rough. Not every new venture needs debt capital, right? Or needs it right away. So if your next venture doesn't need that type of capital and you're able to get out and prove that your next venture, right, is worth something, is onto something, maybe get some other equity investors to back you, you could get back in the game pretty quickly after a Chapter 7. Right. You just won't be able to rely on sources of capital that will view your credit history over the merits of the business that you're pursuing, right? Okay. That's not going to be easy for everybody, right? Which is why, like, even with the capital that a fund might have, we didn't want the credit history ding if we could avoid it, right? So it comes back to understanding your options. You know, Chapter 11s, the reorgs, if you will, you may still be in the same business, just under, you know, a different organizational structure. Chapter 13, you might not even change your business. You might be lucky enough to just get a restructured debt schedule and keep it moving. But I'll say this, right? Like, you want to land the ship gracefully enough that you not only preserve your optionality for the business that you're in, that you preserve your optionality for your next business. I worked with a founder, helped him raise a couple $1 million or so for a cybersecurity startup. It was his 9th startup venture. 9th. 2 were successful. 7 weren't. Right, 6 weren't. Right, and then we're on number 9 right now. And so those other 6 got wound down a variety of different ways, right? You know, one thing he wanted to focus on was preserving his equity in this new venture because, you know, he hadn't hit that home run financially the way he wanted to on his other ventures for a variety of different reasons, right? He's actually a professor at your undergrad alma mater, Duke. Really good guy. But you often will run into serial entrepreneurs. Some that were in the business for a long time and sold, some that were in businesses that failed and they pivoted. And what you don't always get to see is the inner workings behind it, right? So one thing you always want to do is be in control of your narrative, right? There are a lot of people claiming to be six-time entrepreneurs that failed miserably 5 times, right? You don't want to limit yourself if you have a new venture that you vetted the merits of it, you vetted the financial kind of prospects of it, and it's a good venture and you've got backing, right? Like, you don't want to ding yourself because you you failed before, you want to take what you learned from that, right? And make sure that you don't make that same mistake again.
Absolutely. You know, you reminded me, and this is often cited, about Thomas Edison and his patents. He had something like 4,500 patents or something like that. You know, 1,100 of them were actually, you know, successful. So like, if you think about it, on one hand, you're like, dude, this dude actually patented 1,100 things that like changed the world. But you also think about it as like 3,300 times he failed. Like his patents actually didn't, or his inventions didn't end up becoming worth anything or add value, I suppose. And so I was just bringing it up to say that there are a number of times in which, you know, an entrepreneur or a business owner has to recognize and realize that it's time to shut it down. It does not mean that it's the end of the world for you and your innovation.
Or if you get out ahead of it early enough, like there's the pivot. So of that 1,100, there's a high probability that a good number of those 1,100 that got patents did not get patents for what he initially intended to use that invention for. Right. There are inventions around us left and right that, you know, the inventor was actually looking to make something else, right? And they found that it did this other thing, right? Can't think of any kind of coffee table worthy right now, but there's tons of them out there, right? And so, yeah, like that, the pivot is important, right? So private equity operations, like I made my money on the pivot, right? Not the kind of sell as a last resort. Like, what's the pivot? We work with a company that created in-car headsets. So this is back in the day when like people had more kids and you throw the kids in the back of a minivan and like they make a lot of noise. So you give them some headsets, they can listen to TV, they can be quiet, right? And you can like continue driving in peace. Well, that market was declining before the recession in 2008, 2009, and hit that company so hard when the recession actually hit that they were doing like 6-figure, 7-figure revenue at some point. Like it was really, really bad, right? Really, really bad. You know, fortunately, like we were a fund that we were the equity and the debt. So we were able to restructure some things and focus on the pivot, right? Like size of that, right? Like, so they pivoted, they tinkered a few things and they actually created, the guys in the lab created these USB ports that go in cars. And the USB ports they created allowed iPhones, right, to, you were able to plug your iPhone into the car and the iPhone would think it's the master and your car would think it's the master. Effectively, it was a predecessor to Apple CarPlay, right? It allowed Apple to test out their technology and everything else. So this company that was down to like the bare minimum, when I got called in there to help them, they need some help with like cash planning and forecasting. So I was in there working with the CFO. But we sold that business for like 9 figures, right? And I think some ridiculous return north of like 40-50% return on our investment. Because at the time we sold them, they had booked up $400 million worth of backlog revenue for this new product, right? So they could have kept banging their heads down this headphone path and wound up and ended up in bankruptcy. But what they did was they restructured with their lender effectively, right? Bought themselves more time, pivoted, and boom, right? So
yeah, that's amazing. That's amazing. Well, listen, Kwam, this has been, you know, a riveting conversation. I really appreciate your insight and thoughts on what a business can do when it's nearing the end of the road. There are a few lessons that I took from the conversation, and you know, we'll be excited to hear what feedback, you know, the PowerMoves.NOLA community has, and things that they took away. You know, something that I've learned, one is that you harped on a bunch is around having that foresight and insight, and so you know, not waiting too late to start thinking about, you know, what the next 12, 18 months, you know, could look like, and whether or not you should actually continue the business that you are currently in. in addition to that, it's like once you make a decision that this may not be the most viable path for a business, you have some options at your disposal. And thinking about whether it's restructuring your debt with your creditors, or finding a collaborator in the space that might want to acquire, or pivoting out and doing something in a related or synergistic field, are all options at your disposal. And so, I think those are like some really, cool lessons and things for us all to keep in mind, our small business owners, as they are going about making some of their hardest decisions. I think finally the most important thing to learn is that, first of all, business failure is something that is commonplace, and it does not mean that you, the business owner or the entrepreneur, are a failure. It just means that your product didn't work out, or your service, experienced turbulence, and you had to go in a different direction. And that there are many inventions and inventors around us who have failed miserably and have succeeded wonderfully. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive. And so I'm really appreciative of you for sharing, that wisdom, and reminding us all of those points today. So thank you again for your time. Did you have anything that you wanted to leave us with before we let our listeners and our participants, get back to their wintry days?
No, I think, first of all, thanks for having me. I think every business owner is going to feel like their situation is specific and different, right? There are people out there that can help you if thinking the way that we discuss is not second nature for you, right? So some of those options are more affordable than others, but look into those options. Don't be afraid to get help, right? The only thing I mean.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Kwam, again, thank you so much for your time. Anna and the PowerMoves.NOLA team, thank you for having this conversation. Everyone, we look forward to your engagement going forward. We are going to be having this as a series, hopefully, in which we'll talk about similar topics and make sure that we are pulling from broad perspectives in ways in which we discuss, how to support businesses and business owners, as the inevitable wind down may occur. You're not alone, and your PowerMoves.NOLA community are here to help you. Thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to seeing you in our next session.